As a multimedia franchise consisting of not just movies, but also books, games, toys, and cooking equipment, Star Wars has always had a difficult line to walk in terms of the role different media types play within the franchise. Today I want to talk about the issues which are sometimes caused by that, particularly with reference to the old Legends expanded universe, and how the new canon could either avoid those issues or fall into a bunch of new traps. And to be clear, this isn't to call authors or creators of the old or new material stupid or something. When I talk about these as issues, I don't mean it as something that's like self-evidently stupid that's being done. They're problems where I don't know if there's a clear solution, and the thing that sounds best on an individual basis may not be what allows the franchise to survive long term. One of the big issues the Legends expanded universe started to run into towards the end of its run, particularly in the novels set after episode 6 as they got further and further away from the time period of the movies, was an inability to move past legacy characters, most notably the main trio of stars from the original trilogy. Luke, Han, and Leia understandably played a large role in storylines after the Battle of Endor, but when publishing of new Legends material ended, the final book, Crucible, was set 40 years after Palpatine's death. Han was about 75, while Luke and Leia were about 65. There was an expectation that the next 3 novels set to come out, the Sword of the Jedi trilogy by Christie Golden, would finally pass the torch to a new set of characters. There was Jaina Solo, the only surviving child of Han and Leia, as well as Ben Skywalker, the son of Luke. Maybe also Alana Solo, the daughter of Jaina's deceased twin brother Jacen. These novels were cancelled alongside the reboot of the published material, but even if they had come out, I'm not sure how fully that torch would have been passed. Ever since the 19-book New Jedi Order series set 20 years before Crucible, this idea that the torch was being passed to the next generation had existed, but every new storyline which popped up saw the original trio springing back into action, maybe a little less limber but no less involved than before. Part of getting these 3 out of the way for new characters even involved potential plans to kill off Luke in the early planning phases of the New Jedi Order series, but that went out the window pretty quickly. The death of Anakin Solo in the New Jedi Order instead, the youngest son of Han and Leia, wasn't necessarily a departure from this plan, since Jaina and Jacen could both have stepped up to fill that role on their own. And when the Dark Nest trilogy came out, Jaina and Jacen were pretty much on an even footing with their parents and their aunt and uncle. But when the 9-book Legacy of the 4 series came out, it involved Jacen Solo falling to the dark side and then getting killed by Jaina, taking out yet another of the characters who would have otherwise been expected to carry the series into a new era. And despite the fact that Jaina was Jacen's twin, someone for whom the storyline would have been pretty important, Jaina gets nowhere near as much attention as Luke, Han, and Leia in that series. In a lot of cases, she feels pretty sidelined, especially early on. While I do think this is a situation where Jaina should have gotten more attention anyways, I don't really know what the solution to Luke, Han, and Leia's continually dominant roles would be. I've always been more of a book person than a movie person, and I got into Star Wars more through the books, especially these post-Endor books, than through the movies. So for me, just continuing on with whichever characters rise while others go away, like some kind of perpetual space soap opera, would probably have been my preference, but I can't project my preferences onto every Star Wars fan, but most importantly, I'm really not sure how sustainable that actually is as far as getting new readers. The question really comes down to whether novels that are a few generations removed from recognizable characters like Luke, Han, and Leia have the same ability to attract new readers, especially if there isn't other media coming out like the prequels did to just generally bring interest in the franchise up. And I can't say the answer to that question is yes, at least with any level of confidence. All I can say is that you should like this video and subscribe for more. There are certainly storylines and periods that rely heavily or entirely on their own original creations, like the Knights of the Old Republic games, which were quite popular, and the Legacy comics set 100 years after Crucible, with Han, Luke, and Leia being dead already. But these tend to still be somewhat self-contained, and they still came out at points where flagship movie releases were bringing up interest in the franchise as a whole, even if those games and comics didn't include movie characters themselves. But just as importantly, those properties weren't required to carry the story forward as the main property on their own. You could just as easily jump into them from the movies as anything else, and there wasn't a feeling that you needed to know anything else. Maybe a bit less so in the case of Legacy, which relied a little bit more on prior Dark Horse comics. But as time went on, the post-Endor novels were essentially unmoored from any expectation of further movies or TV releases in the era, which on the one hand prevented them from being subject to the kind of, in the words of Dave Filoni himself, canon bomb that can happen when you have a project like the Clone Wars cartoon being inserted into an established timeline. On the other hand, if they keep telling one story and building on themselves, it's a lot harder to get people invested into the newer characters without feeling like they need to do a lot of homework. I've never really been one to think you actually have to read everything in a given series to understand what's going on. I get a lot of objections to this when I mention it with the High Republic, where I say I don't read all the young reader novels or comics, but I think most stories are intentionally set up in a way that you can get pretty quickly up to speed no matter where you step in. And humans are usually pretty good at picking up context. After all, one of my first Star Wars novels was Star by Star, which is right in the middle of the Yuuzhan Vong War. I didn't know everything that was going on or all the backstory of the characters, but there's definitely at least the impression that you have to keep up with everything to understand what's going on, which can put some people off when they feel like they're falling behind, or if they're potentially a new fan who hasn't engaged with anything before and they're not sure if they can just jump in. You can see some of this with the Star Wars TV shows where people will just say, oh, there's too much now, or especially with Marvel movies and shows. I used to keep up with basically everything coming out at Marvel, but as soon as I missed one thing, I kind of just fell off the whole thing, even though I could probably just go watch one of the new movies and it wouldn't be a big deal. I mean, I know what a superhero is, I can probably pick it up from there. But this is an area where I think new canon under Disney has at least one advantage over the novels being the only way forward for the latter-day expanded universe, even if it is a bit of a double-edged sword. The sequels and the potential for new shows or movies set after them can become new touchstones, allowing new characters to be introduced and pushing the story further along while giving a clear entry point for new potential fans. If we'd moved towards Rey, Finn, and Poe as characters only introduced in the books, with Luke, Han, and Leia gone, then it's far less likely a kid would pick up a book with them on the cover and become a new fan entering cold into the world of Star Wars. They're far more likely to do that now since those characters were introduced first by a movie. But on top of a potential feeling of being overwhelmed by too much media, this is where we get to the second edge of that double-edged sword. Once you have a multimedia franchise where there is the expectation you'll get more movies or shows in that period, unlike with Legends, the important storytelling tends to get shifted away from books or comics and into the shows. Shows and movies are the way you pull the most new fans in, and they have the most potential to make money. So if you're going to tell the story of a big new plot point, it's often going to be done through a movie or a TV show rather than a book. And if you're trying to attract a showrunner, a writer, or a director, it's much easier if you have fewer conditions on what they're beholden to. I don't think a novel series would be allowed to drive the post-Endor period forward now the way the New Jedi Order series did before. As proof of this, we really just have to look at the fact that no books have been allowed to be published about those characters after the Rise of Skywalker, which came out 6 years ago now. So as a result, novels are often relegated to telling stories meant to fill in gaps, limiting how much new stuff of galactic importance can happen. This has meant there's more stories involving new characters which I have really enjoyed, like the Alphabet Squadron trilogy, which are among my favorite Star Wars novels of all time, and Lost Stars. But unfortunately, when it comes to books featuring movie or TV show characters, we're mostly just able to see them taking steps we already knew they'd take, or they're just doing far less important side adventures that can't really impact anything. There's a fairly recent book called The Mask of Fear, which I absolutely loved. It tells the story of the early formation of the rebellion by Mon Mothma, Saw Gerrera, and Bail Organa. But as great as it is, it's still far more about filling a known gap. I also enjoyed the Acolyte Wayseeker and the new Bad Batch novel Sanctuary, but they pretty definitively feel like they fall into that side story gap, to the point that they're the novels which prompted me to make this video. Again, none of this means they're bad, I generally enjoyed both. But it raises the question of whether we're heading further and further to a point where not only are the shows and movies the best jumping off point for new fans, they're also given a monopoly on important storytelling. I've been focusing on books and to a lesser extent comics, but you could also apply this to games or other media types as well. To be fair, I don't know if the cooking equipment ever added that much to any Star Wars story, but we can throw that in too. I think the High Republic gives an interesting case study of what it looks like to get around some of these issues, and it ends up looking a lot like what the Legacy comics and Knights of the Old Republic did in the examples I gave earlier. The High Republic is set almost a century before even the Acolyte, so it had pretty free reign to do what it wanted with its own characters throughout its run. Unlike the New Jedi Order and Beyond in Legends, it also didn't need to worry about setting up the entire future of the franchise in perpetuity with its characters. If we had Sword of the Jedi and then other novels coming out after it, they would need to be the thing somehow dragging in enough new fans to make the franchise sustainable on their own, but the High Republic doesn't need to do that. There's enough other Star Wars media going on in the show and movie side around them that a High Republic book on the shelves in 10 years doesn't need to be the only thing capable of drawing in a new Star Wars fan. I think it's also helpful when this is just one of many projects going on. If you didn't happen to be a fan of the direction of the post-Endor Legends continuity, then it would be hard to pull you back in as the story continued to progress. But with the High Republic, if you didn't like it, that doesn't really have any implications for your ability to enjoy other parts of the franchise. But ultimately, while this is a way for books to tell their own story where you don't know the conclusion, it does still leave the quote-unquote main saga entirely within the hands of visual media. Is that inherently a bad thing? Not necessarily, but it does change the types of books we're able to get. Is the real problem potentially just that franchises which go on forever may not be the best thing for media in general? Maybe, but my job forces me to say no, definitely not. Either way, I hope you've enjoyed whatever this was. Thank you for watching, special thanks to Marmar for editing this video, as well as to the channel members and patrons who make this channel possible.